There are towns in America that time seems to forget, places where the highway curves away just enough that you'd miss the exit if you weren't looking. Corydon, Illinois was one of those towns. Population 3,200, give or take. Flat cornfields stretching in every direction like an ocean frozen mid-wave. A single main street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office that closed at 3. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your family, and what you'd done 3 Sundays ago at church. In October of 1997, Corydon was a town where nothing ever happened, until Melissa Hartwell disappeared. It was a Thursday evening, October 23rd. The sun had already dropped below the horizon, leaving that peculiar twilight glow that makes everything look slightly unreal. Melissa had told her mother she was walking to her friend Sarah's house, just 4 blocks away on Birch Street. It was a route she'd taken hundreds of times, safe, familiar. The kind of walk parents didn't think twice about in a town like Corydon. But Melissa never arrived at Sarah's house. Her mother, Patricia Hartwell, didn't realize anything was wrong until nearly 9 o'clock that night when Sarah's mother called, asking if Melissa was still coming over. The confusion in that phone call turned to concern within seconds, concern to panic within minutes. Patricia tried Melissa's pager 3 times, no response. She called every friend whose number she had. Nothing. By 9:30, she was on the phone with the Corydon Police Department. Sheriff Tom Brennan had been with the department for 22 years. He'd handled drunk drivers, domestic disputes, the occasional theft from the farm supply store. Missing persons weren't something Corydon dealt with. Not really. When Patricia Hartwell's call came through, his first instinct was the same as any small-town sheriff. She probably went to a friend's house and lost track of time. Teenagers did that. But something in Patricia's voice, that edge of maternal terror that can't be faked, made him take it seriously. By 10 o'clock, half the town was searching. Volunteers fanned out across Corydon with flashlights and thermoses of coffee. They called Melissa's name into the darkness, their voices echoing off the empty storefronts on Main Street, bouncing across the fields. Patricia walked the route between her house and Sarah's over and over, as if repetition might somehow rewrite what had happened, might make her daughter materialize on the sidewalk with an apologetic smile. It was a volunteer named Dennis Morton who first suggested checking the old Rossmore grain elevator. The elevator sat about a mile outside town, just off County Road 12. It had been abandoned since the early 80s when the farming co-op went bankrupt. Most people avoided it. The structure was dangerous, all rusted metal and rotting wooden platforms. But it was also the kind of place teenagers sometimes went to drink beer or carve their initials into the weathered walls. Dennis remembered his own daughter mentioning it once. Sheriff Brennan organized a group to check it out. 8 men and 2 women, equipped with heavy-duty flashlights and walkie-talkies. The fog had rolled in thick by then, turning their flashlight beams into solid columns of white that seemed to end just a few feet ahead. The grain elevator loomed out of the darkness like the skeleton of some massive creature, all angles and shadows. They found nothing that night, just graffiti, empty beer cans, and the overwhelming smell of rust and decay. They called Melissa's name until their voices went hoarse. The only response was the wind moving through the metal, creating sounds that almost resembled whispers. Almost. It wasn't until daylight came, when the search resumed with fresh volunteers and a clearer sense of purpose, that things began to feel wrong in a way no one could quite articulate. The fog lifted slowly that Friday morning, revealing the grain elevator in harsh autumn sunlight. What they'd missed in the darkness now became visible. Around the perimeter of the structure, in the soft mud near the drainage creek, there were footprints. At first, Sheriff Brennan assumed they were from the search party the night before. But these prints were different. They were deeper, for one thing, pressed into the mud with significant weight. And the pattern was strange, almost like boot prints, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the toe end. 5 distinct grooves. Deputy Marcus Webb, who'd grown up hunting in these parts, crouched beside them for a long time, not saying anything. "Well?" Brennan finally asked. Webb stood up slowly, brushing mud from his hands. "I don't know what made these, Tom. I really don't. They followed the prints as far as they could. They led from the tree line toward the grain elevator, circled the structure twice, then headed back toward the woods. But they didn't follow a straight path. They zigzagged, doubled back, created patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and in several places the prints were joined by smaller ones, human-sized, sneaker treads, Melissa's size. The discovery sent a jolt of renewed urgency through the search. If Melissa had been here, if she'd been with someone or something, then time was critical. They expanded the search into the woods, a dense tangle of oak and hickory that bordered the creek. The terrain was difficult, full of deadfall and thick underbrush, the kind of place that could hide anything. It was during this expanded search that they found the sketchbook. A volunteer named Linda Kress was the one who spotted it. She'd ventured inside the grain elevator, climbing carefully up a half-collapsed metal staircase to check the upper levels. The structure groaned with every step, rust flaking away beneath her boots. On the 3rd level, wedged between 2 support beams near a broken window, she found it, Melissa's sketchbook. Patricia had confirmed Melissa always carried it with her, tucked into her backpack. It was a cheap spiral-bound thing from the drugstore, the cover decorated with Melissa's own drawings of trees and stars. Linda opened it carefully, mindful not to damage any potential evidence. The last page had a drawing of a crow, meticulously detailed in pencil. But the page had been torn diagonally, leaving only the top 2/3 intact, and across the remaining corner was a smudge, dark earth, mixed with something rust-colored that might have been blood. The edges of the tear looked deliberate, almost surgical. Linda didn't touch it again. She backed down the stairs carefully and radioed Sheriff Brennan immediately. The sketchbook was bagged and sent to the Illinois State Police Crime Lab in Springfield. The smudge was tested. The results came back 3 days later. The soil was consistent with the area around the grain elevator, and the rust-colored substance was indeed blood. Type O positive, Melissa's blood type. But the quantity was small, just a few drops really. Not enough to indicate serious injury, just enough to confirm she'd been there. The town of Corydon began to fracture under the weight of not knowing. Rumors spread like wildfire. Someone said they'd seen a strange car parked near the grain elevator the week before, a dark sedan with out-of-state plates. Someone else claimed Melissa had seemed distracted lately, like something was troubling her. The theories multiplied. She'd run away, she'd been abducted, she'd met with an accident in the woods and was lying injured somewhere, waiting to be found. And then there were the other rumors. The ones people only whispered about late at night, usually after a few drinks at McGinley's Tavern. Talk of the strange prints in the mud. Talk of old stories from decades past. Hunters who'd claimed to see things in those woods that didn't make sense. Shapes that moved wrong. Sounds that didn't belong to any animal they recognized. Dennis Morton's grandfather had been one of those hunters. He'd told stories about the woods near Corydon. Stories that dated back to when he was a young man in the 30s. He talked about nights when the forest would go completely silent, not even crickets chirping. Nights when something large moved through the trees, snapping branches too high for deer, leaving behind a smell like wet dog mixed with something metallic. Something that made experienced hunters turn around and head home without taking a single shot. Most people dismiss those stories as frontier mythology, the kind of tall tales old men told to spook their grandkids. But after Melissa disappeared, after those strange prints were found, some people started to wonder. The search continued for 2 weeks. The FBI sent agents from Chicago to assist. They brought cadaver dogs and thermal imaging equipment. They interviewed everyone in town, created timelines, analyzed phone records. Melissa's room was searched top to bottom. Her diary was read cover to cover. Nothing in it suggested she was planning to run away. She was a good student. No behavioral problems, no secret boyfriend, no drug use. She was, by all accounts, a normal 14-year-old girl who loved drawing birds and wanted to be a veterinarian someday. The dogs picked up her scent trail, leading from her house toward Sarah's, then veering off about 3 blocks in, heading toward County Road 12, toward the grain elevator. The trail went cold at the edge of the woods, right where the strange footprints had been found. It was as if she'd simply vanished into thin air. The media descended on Corydon. For a few weeks, Melissa's face was everywhere. Newspapers, television, missing person posters stapled to every telephone pole. Patricia Hartwell gave tearful interviews pleading for her daughter's safe return. Melissa's older brother, Daniel, barely 18, dropped out of his first semester at Southern Illinois University to help search. The family's grief was raw and public, a wound that refused to close. But as weeks turned into months with no new leads, the media moved on. The FBI agents returned to Chicago. The volunteers went back to their normal lives. The search parties dwindled from dozens to a handful, to eventually just Patricia and Daniel walking the woods every weekend, calling Melissa's name into the silence. The case went cold. Sheriff Brennan kept it open, kept the file on his desk where he'd see it every day. But without evidence, without witnesses, without a body, there was nowhere to go. The strange footprints remained unexplained. The state police had theorized they might be from a large dog, though the size and pattern didn't quite match any known breed. The torn sketchbook, the small amount of blood, the trail that ended at the woods. They were pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Corydon tried to move on, but a town that small never really forgets. Melissa's disappearance became part of the town's identity, a shadow that hung over everything. Parents held their children closer. The grain elevator was eventually condemned and fenced off, though that didn't stop the occasional teenager from climbing through to leave flowers at the spot where the sketchbook was found. Patricia Hartwell never moved, never changed Melissa's room, never stopped hoping that someday her daughter would walk through the front door with an explanation that would make it all make sense. Years passed. 1997 became 1998, then 2000, then 2005. Daniel graduated from college, became a civil engineer, got married. He named his first daughter Melissa. Patricia's hair went gray, then white. Sheriff Brennan retired, and the case file was transferred to his successor, a younger woman named Rachel Ortiz, who'd grown up 2 towns over and remembered the news coverage from when she was in high school. The world changed around Corydon, but the mystery remained. And then, in March of 2024, everything shifted. A man named Leonard Pike was arrested in Bloomington, Indiana, 230 miles southeast of Corydon, for the attempted kidnapping of a 16-year-old girl from a Target parking lot. Pike was 59 years old, a long-haul trucker with a history of minor offenses, drunk driving, assault, statutory rape from 30 years ago that he'd served minimal time for. The attempted kidnapping was clumsy, desperate. The girl screamed, bystanders intervened. Pike was tackled by an off-duty firefighter and held until police arrived. When police searched Pike's truck, they found a lockbox bolted beneath the passenger seat. Inside were Polaroid photographs, dozens of them. Young girls, most appearing to be between 12 and 16 years old. Some of the photos looked recent, digital prints that had been converted to Polaroids. Others were old, faded from the 80s and 90s. The girls were in various locations, parking lots, bus stops, parks. None appeared to be aware their photo was being taken. And near the bottom of the stack, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, was a Polaroid of a girl in an oversized grey hoodie, standing near a grain elevator at dusk. The girl had auburn hair and was holding a sketchbook. When the Bloomington Police Department ran the photo through their missing persons database, the match came back immediately. Melissa Ann Hartwell. Missing from Corydon, Illinois, October 1997. Leonard Pike had been in their town 27 years ago, and he'd taken a picture of Melissa Hartwell just hours, maybe minutes, before she disappeared. The news hit Corydon like a bomb. Within 48 hours, Indiana State Police, FBI agents, and Sheriff Ortiz were sitting across from Leonard Pike in an interrogation room in Bloomington. Pike had already lawyered up, but his attorney knew the case was a disaster. The photos were damning. Pike's trucking logs from 1997 showed he'd made a delivery to a farm supply warehouse just outside Corydon on October 23rd. He'd been in the area. He had opportunity. And now they had proof he'd seen Melissa that day. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Pike said almost nothing, just sat there with his arms crossed, occasionally whispering to his attorney. But investigators pressed, using every technique they had. They showed him the Polaroid. They showed him Melissa's school photo. They described Patricia Hartwell's decades of grief. They told him they were going to search every storage unit he'd ever rented, every property he'd ever owned, every route he'd ever driven. Finally, late in the evening, Pike asked for a private moment with his attorney. When they resumed, his lawyer made a statement. Leonard Pike was willing to cooperate, but he wanted a deal. Was that photograph just evidence of opportunity, or proof of something darker that had waited 27 years to surface? The deal Leonard Pike wanted was simple on paper, complicated in practice. He would tell investigators what happened to Melissa Hartwell in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. His attorney argued that without a body, without physical evidence directly linking Pike to a homicide, the state's case was circumstantial at best. The Polaroid proved he'd seen Melissa that day, but it didn't prove murder. The prosecutor from Monroe County, a sharp woman named Diana Vasquez, knew Pike's attorney was right. 27 years had passed. Physical evidence would be nearly impossible to recover. Witnesses' memories had faded or become unreliable. If they wanted answers for Patricia Hartwell, if they wanted to know what happened to Melissa, they needed Pike to talk. The deal was struck. Pike would plead guilty to second-degree murder and provide the location of Melissa's remains. In exchange, he would serve life in prison without parole, avoiding lethal injection. It was a compromise that tasted like ash in everyone's mouth, but it was the only path forward. On March 19, 2024, Leonard Pike gave his confession. He'd been driving through Illinois on a long haul from Kansas City to Indianapolis, Pike said, running behind schedule because of a flat tire outside of St. Louis. He'd stopped in Corydon to make a delivery at the farm supply warehouse, then grabbed dinner at the diner on Main Street. It was dusk when he left, and he'd decided to take County Road 12 instead of the highway, a shortcut he'd learned from previous runs. That's when he saw her, a girl walking alone on the side of the road, heading away from town. Oversized hoodie, backpack, moving with the distracted pace of someone lost in their own thoughts. Pike said something in him just switched. He described it clinically, without emotion, as if he were recounting a trip to the grocery store. He pulled over, rolled down his window, asked if she needed a ride. She said no, polite but firm. She was only going a little ways up the road, so he waited until she passed, then got out of his truck and followed her on foot. The interrogation room recording captured every word, and later, when it was played in court, people in the gallery wept openly. Pike's voice was flat, detached. He described following Melissa for about a quarter mile, waiting until she turned off onto the dirt access road that led to the grain elevator. There were no houses out there, no witnesses, just empty fields and the dying light of dusk. He said he called out to her, made up some story about needing directions. When she turned around, he grabbed her. Melissa fought. Pike had scratches on his arms for days afterward, he said. She screamed, but there was no one to hear. He dragged her into the tree line near the grain elevator, his hand clamped over her mouth. She bit him hard enough to draw blood. Her sketchbook fell from her backpack during the struggle, and in trying to grab it back, the pages tore. What happened next, Pike claimed, was an accident. He was trying to quiet her, he said, his hand pressed over her mouth and nose. He held it there too long. When he finally let go, she wasn't breathing. He'd killed her without meaning to. Manslaughter, his attorney would later argue. Not first-degree murder, a tragic mistake made in a moment of panic. The investigators didn't believe the accident narrative for a second, but they needed the location. Where had he taken the body? Pike described driving his truck down the access road to the grain elevator. It was muddy, difficult terrain, but his rig could handle it. He'd wrapped Melissa's body in a tarp he kept in the truck, along with her backpack and the sketchbook. Then he'd driven east, away from Corydon, into the network of rural farm roads that crisscrossed the flatlands. About 40 minutes outside of town, he'd found what he was looking for, an abandoned well on a property that had been foreclosed years earlier. He'd dumped her body down the well, followed by the tarp and her belongings. Then he'd covered the opening with the rotted boards that had been lying nearby and drove away. He was back on the highway within an hour, continuing his route to Indianapolis as if nothing had happened. The well was located using Pike's directions, cross-referenced with property records and satellite imagery. It was on what had once been the Gerhardt Farm, a 160-acre property that had sat vacant since the bank seized it in 1994. The land had been sold twice since then, but both times to investment companies that never developed it. It just sat there, fields gone to seed, the old farmhouse collapsing in on itself, and yes, a stone-lined well about 30 yards from where the house had stood. A recovery team was assembled. Sheriff Ortiz drove out with the FBI, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Illinois, and a chaplain that Patricia Hartwell had requested be present. The media was kept at a distance, but news helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thumping like mechanical heartbeats. The well was approximately 40 feet deep. A camera was lowered first, its LED lights illuminating the darkness below. The footage showed scattered debris, old boards, leaves, a rusted bucket, and near the bottom, partially covered in sediment and organic matter, human remains. The recovery took 2 days. It was painstaking work, documenting every detail, ensuring nothing was missed. When the remains were finally brought to the surface, the forensic anthropologist conducted a preliminary examination on site. The skeleton was mostly intact, consistent with a young adolescent female. Clothing fragments matched what Melissa had been wearing. The grey hoodie, denim fibers, rubber from sneakers, and tangled in the ribcage was a tarnished silver necklace with a small bird charm that Patricia immediately identified as the one she'd given Melissa for her 13th birthday. It was her. After 27 years, Melissa Hartwell had been found. The state of Illinois moved forward with the prosecution. Leonard Pike's confession was solid, his guilt not in question. The trial was a formality, really. Pike had already pleaded guilty as part of his deal. The proceedings were more about giving the community closure, allowing Patricia Hartwell to face the man who'd taken her daughter. Patricia sat in the front row every day of the trial, her son Daniel beside her. She never cried, at least not visibly. She just stared at Pike with an intensity that made even the bailiffs uncomfortable. When she was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement, she spoke for 11 minutes. She described Melissa's love of drawing, her quiet laugh, the way she'd hum to herself while sketching. She described the 27 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope, of Christmases and birthdays marked by absence. And she looked directly at Pike and told him that whatever justice the court delivered, it would never be enough. Pike was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois. Patricia attended the sentencing but left immediately after. She didn't speak to reporters, didn't make any statements. She just went home to Corydon. The town held a memorial service for Melissa at the same church where they'd held a prayer vigil back in 1997. Hundreds attended. Melissa was finally laid to rest in Corydon Cemetery under an oak tree, her headstone engraved with a small bird in flight. And that should have been the end of the story. A terrible tragedy, finally resolved. A monster caught and punished. Closure, as much as such a thing exists. But there were details that didn't quite fit. Details that Sheriff Ortiz noticed but couldn't fully reconcile with Pike's confession. Details that nagged at her late at night when she went over the case files one more time, unable to shake the feeling that something was missing. The footprints, for instance, the strange tracks found in the mud near the grain elevator back in 1997 had been documented thoroughly. Photographs, plaster casts, measurements. They'd been compared to Pike's boot size. He wore a size 11. The prints in the mud were larger, significantly larger, and the claw marks at the toe end didn't match any boot or shoe. The original investigative report had theorized a large dog, possibly a Mastiff or Great Dane. But the gait pattern was wrong for a canine. The stride length suggested something that walked upright. When Sheriff Ortiz brought this up with the FBI agents, they'd shrugged it off. Pike probably had an accomplice, they said, or maybe the prints were from earlier, unrelated to the crime. The woods near the grain elevator were accessible to hunters, hikers, anyone really. The prints could have been from days or even weeks before Melissa disappeared. But Deputy Marcus Webb, now retired but still living in Corydon, didn't buy that explanation. He'd been the one to examine those prints back in 1997, and he'd never forgotten them. When Ortiz visited him at his home to discuss the case closure, he pulled out a file he'd kept, copies of the photographs, and his personal notes. "These weren't dog prints, Rachel," he said, spreading the photos across his kitchen table. "And they were fresh, made the same night Melissa went missing. I'd stake my life on it. The mud was still damp when we found them, and we'd had dry weather for 3 days before that. Rain came the night of October 23rd, stopped around 7 p.m. Those prints were made after the rain." Ortiz studied the photos. She'd seen them in the official file, but Webb's personal collection included close-ups she hadn't noticed before. The depth of the impressions, the way they seemed to press deeper at the toe end, as if whatever made them had been leaning forward, moving with deliberate weight. "You think Pike had someone with him?" she asked. Webb was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know what to think. Pike says he was alone. His truck records, his phone records, everything backs that up. He was a solo driver, didn't have a partner. But those prints—" He tapped one of the photos. "Something else was out there that night?" There were other inconsistencies too, small things that most people overlooked. The torn sketchbook, for instance. Pike claimed it had been torn during the struggle, accidentally damaged when it fell from Melissa's backpack. But the forensic analysis of the tear showed clean edges, almost surgical precision, not consistent with accidental tearing. And the smudge of blood and soil on the page. Pike's story was that Melissa had bitten his hand and he'd touched the sketchbook while bleeding, but the blood pattern didn't match transfer from a bleeding hand. It looked more like the book had been placed on the ground, pressed into bloody soil, then picked up. And then there was the timeline itself. Pike claimed he'd grabbed Melissa on County Road 12 around 7:30 p.m., killed her accidentally within minutes, then loaded her body into his truck and drove to the well. But the cadaver dogs in 1997 had tracked Melissa's scent into the woods near the grain elevator, not along the road. Her scent trail went from the access road into the tree line, approximately 70 yards, then disappeared. If Pike had grabbed her on the road and immediately taken her to his truck, why would her scent go into the woods? The FBI's explanation was that the dogs had picked up older scent trails. Maybe Melissa had been to the grain elevator before with friends, and the dogs were following residual scent. but the handlers in 1997 had been adamant the scent was fresh from the day she disappeared. Sheriff Ortiz compiled all these discrepancies into a supplementary report. She sent it to the prosecutor's office, to the FBI field office in Springfield, to anyone who might listen. The responses were polite but dismissive. The case was closed. Pike had confessed. The body had been recovered. Yes, there were some inconsistencies, but no case was perfect. Witness memories fade. Forensic analysis from 1997 wasn't as sophisticated as modern techniques, and ultimately they had their man. But Ortiz couldn't let it go. Neither could Deputy Webb. And neither could a handful of other people in Corydon who remembered that October night in 1997, not just for what happened, but for what they'd felt. Dennis Morton, the man who'd suggested checking the grain elevator during the initial search, still lived on the same property his grandfather had left him. 20 acres backing up to the same woods where Melissa had disappeared. About 6 months after Pike's sentencing, Ortiz paid him a visit. Dennis was 71 now, still sharp, still active. He invited her in for coffee, and they sat in his living room, the windows overlooking the tree line in the distance. "You're here about the prince," Dennis said. It wasn't a question. "Among other things," Ortiz replied. "You knew this area better than anyone back in 97. You spent time in those woods. What do you really think was out there?" Dennis stared out the window for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about these woods, not fairy tales. He was a practical man, a farmer and hunter. But he swore there were nights when something moved through here that didn't belong, something that made the forest go quiet. He called it the Walker. Never saw it clearly, just shapes between the trees, too tall to be a man, moving too deliberately to be an animal." "Do you believe those stories?" Ortiz asked. Dennis turned to look at her. "I know what I heard the night we searched for Melissa. We were out there calling her name, and the woods just stopped. No insects, no birds, nothing, just dead silence. And then way off in the distance I heard something moving. Heavy footsteps breaking through underbrush, too rhythmic to be deer, too large to be anything else I recognized." "Could have been another searcher," Ortiz suggested. "At 3 in the morning, a mile from where anyone else was searching, moving away from the grain elevator instead of toward it." Dennis shook his head. "I followed the sound for a few minutes, trying to catch up, thinking maybe someone had gone off course. But the faster I moved, the farther away it got, and then it just stopped. Like whatever it was had vanished." Ortiz didn't know what to say to that. It sounded like the kind of story people told themselves when grief and fear twisted perception. But Dennis Morton was a reliable witness, level-headed, not prone to dramatics. "Did you ever see tracks?" she asked. "Before or after that night?" Dennis nodded slowly. "A few times over the years, always after heavy rain, always near the creek bed. Same kind of prints they found in 97. I stopped telling people about it because they looked at me like I was crazy. But they're real. I've seen them with my own eyes." Ortiz left Dennis Morton's house with more questions than answers. She drove out to the old Gerhardt farm where Melissa's body had been recovered. The well had been filled in and capped after the recovery, but the property still sat empty, fields overgrown with thistle and prairie grass. She walked the perimeter, trying to imagine Leonard Pike driving out here in the dark 27 years ago, desperate to hide what he'd done. The logistics made sense. The property was isolated, the well convenient. But why this place specifically? Pike had never been to Corydon before October 1997. He didn't know the area, yet somehow he'd found this particular abandoned farm, this particular well in the dark, under pressure, without GPS or modern navigation. When she'd asked him about it during interrogation, Pike had been vague. He'd just driven until he found somewhere suitable, he said. Got lucky, if you could call it that. But Ortiz had driven the same route. From the grain elevator to the Gerhardt farm was a maze of unmarked farm roads, easy to get lost even in daylight. For Pike to navigate it at night, in an unfamiliar area while transporting a body, it seemed unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely, unless someone had guided him, unless he hadn't been alone. But Pike insisted he'd worked alone. His entire criminal history suggested he was a solitary operator. And there was no evidence, no phone records, no witness statements, no financial transactions that pointed to an accomplice. So what was the alternative? That Pike's confession was partially false? That he was covering for something or someone else? Or that something else had been involved that night, something that couldn't be explained in a courtroom or a police report? Ortiz stood in the empty field as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown land. The wind picked up, rustling through the grass with a sound like whispers, and for just a moment she understood why people in Corydon still talked about those woods in hushed tones, why some parents still didn't let their kids walk alone after dark, why the grain elevator, even fenced and condemned, carried a weight that had nothing to do with rusted metal and old memories. Some places held onto their secrets, and some secrets refused to be neatly categorized, explained away, or closed in a file marked "Solved." Back in town, life continued. Patricia Hartwell had finally been able to grieve properly, to say goodbye to her daughter. The community had rallied around her, and there was a sense of collective relief that Melissa's killer had been caught. Justice, imperfect as it was, had been served. But on quiet nights, when the fog rolled in from the flatlands and turned the streets of Corydon into something out of time, people still wondered. They wondered about the footprints that didn't match. They wondered about the timeline that didn't quite add up. They wondered about the stories their grandparents had told, the ones they'd dismissed as superstition and folklore. And they wondered if Leonard Pike had really been the only monster in those woods the night Melissa Hartwell disappeared. Had they really caught the only presence in those woods that night, or was there something else, watching from the shadows? 3 months after Leonard Pike's sentencing, a documentary filmmaker named Claire Addison reached out to Sheriff Ortiz. Addison specialized in true crime, had produced several well-received series for streaming platforms. She wanted to make a documentary about the Melissa Hartwell case, not just the resolution, but the entire 27-year journey. The decades of searching, the community impact, the eventual arrest and confession. Ortiz was hesitant at first. The case was closed. The community was healing. Did they really need to dredge it all back up for entertainment? But Addison was persistent, and she made a compelling argument. Melissa's story deserved to be told completely, accurately. It could help other families dealing with missing loved ones. It could highlight the dedication of small-town law enforcement. And perhaps most importantly, Patricia Hartwell had already agreed to participate. That last point convinced Ortiz. If Patricia was willing to speak publicly, to share her story, then Ortiz would support it. The documentary crew arrived in Corydon in late June 2024. They interviewed everyone willing to talk, family members, law enforcement, volunteers from the original search, teachers who'd known Melissa, friends who'd grown into adults still carrying the weight of her loss. They filmed at the high school, the cemetery, the sheriff's office, and inevitably they filmed at the grain elevator. The structure looked even worse than it had in 1997. Nearly 3 decades of weathering had taken their toll. The fence around it was falling apart. Graffiti covered every accessible surface, and vegetation had begun to reclaim the ground around it. But it remained, a skeletal monument to that October night. Claire Addison wanted to film inside, on the level where the sketchbook had been found. Ortiz accompanied her, along with a structural engineer who'd assessed the building's safety. The engineer's verdict was grim. The place was a death trap, could collapse at any time, but he identified a route to the 3rd level that was marginally safer than the rest, and they proceeded with extreme caution. The film crew set up lights, transforming the decayed interior into something almost theatrical. Shadows stretched across rusted metal and rotting wood. Addison stood in the spot where Linda Kress had found Melissa's sketchbook, delivering her narration to camera. It was here, wedged between these beams, that searchers discovered the only physical evidence that Melissa Hartwell had been in this building. Her sketchbook, torn and bloodied, offering more questions than answers. While they were filming, one of the camera operators, a young man named Trevor who'd been quiet most of the shoot, called Ortiz over to where he was setting up a wide shot. "Sheriff, you might want to see this," he said, pointing his flashlight at the wall behind him. Ortiz walked over and her breath caught. Scratched into the metal wall, about 8 feet off the ground, were marks she'd never seen before. Deep gouges, 5 parallel lines, each about an inch apart. They ran diagonally across a support beam, the metal actually torn in places, edges curled outward from the force of whatever had made them. "Were these documented before?" Trevor asked. Ortiz had been through the crime scene photos dozens of times. She'd never seen these marks, but that didn't mean they were new. The building had been searched in 1997, but not every square inch had been photographed. These marks were high up, in shadow, easy to miss. She pulled out her phone and snapped several photos, then reached up to touch the gouges. The edges were rough, oxidized, not recent. These had been here for years, possibly decades. "Claire, you need to see this," Ortiz called out. The filmmaker came over, followed by her crew. The lights were repositioned, illuminating the scratches in harsh detail. On camera, they looked even more disturbing, like claw marks, but far too large and too high to be from any animal that should have been in this building. "Could be from machinery," the structural engineer suggested. This was a grain processing facility. Lots of equipment moved through here over the years, but Ortiz had grown up around farm equipment. These marks didn't have the regularity of mechanical damage. They were organic, purposeful. Something had raked these claws across this metal with tremendous force. "I want to bring in someone to analyze these," Addison said. She was already on her phone, making calls. Within 2 hours, she'd arranged for a forensic metallurgist from Purdue University to drive down the next day. The metallurgist's name was Dr. Rajesh Khatri. He spent 3 hours at the grain elevator, taking measurements, samples, photographs. His preliminary analysis was both fascinating and frustrating. The marks were approximately 20 years old, give or take 5 years. They'd been made by something sharp and incredibly strong. The force required to tear through quarter-inch steel like that was substantial. But the pattern didn't match any tool or machine he could identify. "It's almost organic," he told them, standing in the sweltering heat of late June, surrounded by camera equipment and increasingly confused documentary crew. "The angles, the spacing, the way the metal is torn rather than cut. It suggests something alive made these marks. But I have no idea what animal could do this, and do it 8 feet off the ground." The documentary suddenly had an unexpected angle. What had started as a straightforward true crime story was now brushing up against something else, something that didn't have easy answers. Claire Addison was savvy enough to recognize gold when she found it. She pivoted, started asking different questions in her interviews. Had anyone else experienced something unusual near the grain elevator? Had there been other incidents, other stories that might have been dismissed at the time? The responses she got were eye-opening. A woman named Carol Henriksen, now in her 60s, recalled an incident from the summer of 1989. She'd been out walking her dog near the grain elevator. It was already abandoned by then, but the area was popular for evening walks. Her dog, a German shepherd named Rex, had suddenly frozen mid-step, hackles raised, growling at the tree line. Carol had never seen him act like that. She'd called him to heel, but he wouldn't move, just stood there, trembling and growling, staring at something in the woods she couldn't see. Finally, she'd had to physically drag him away, and he'd whined and resisted the entire time. When she got home, she found claw marks on his collar, deep scratches in the leather, as if something had tried to grab him, but nothing had been close enough to touch him, not that she'd seen. A retired postal worker named James Corrigan told the cameras about delivering mail to farms in the area back in the 90s. Multiple times he'd found livestock dead in fields near the woods, cattle and sheep with injuries that the veterinarians couldn't explain. The wounds were too severe for coyotes, wrong pattern for wolves, which weren't even in Illinois, and didn't match anything the farmers recognized. The incidents were always blamed on wild dogs or transient predators, but James remembered farmers talking late at night about something else, something they'd seen moving at the edge of their property, too large and too strange to name. And there was the testimony of a man named William Garrett, who'd been one of the search volunteers in 1997. He'd kept quiet about his experience for 27 years, afraid people would think he was crazy. But now, with cameras rolling and the sheriff asking directly, he finally told his story. William had been searching the woods west of the grain elevator on the second night, October 24th. He was with a group of 6 volunteers, spread out in a line, moving slowly through the dense undergrowth. It was around midnight. Their flashlights cut through the darkness like narrow tunnels of vision, everything else swallowed by shadow. William heard something moving parallel to them, maybe 30 yards to the north. Heavy steps, deliberate. He'd assumed it was another search party, but when he radioed in to check, dispatch confirmed no other groups were in that sector. He'd called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. Just the continued sound of movement. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something large displacing air as it moved. He'd separated from his group against protocol and tried to close the distance. The sounds stayed ahead of him, always just out of flashlight range. And then he'd noticed something that made his blood run cold. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no birds, no small animals. Just the sound of his own breathing and those heavy footsteps ahead. He'd finally stopped, standing in a small clearing, sweeping his flashlight in a wide arc. That's when he saw it, just for a second, at the very edge of his light's reach. A shape, tall, far taller than any man, standing between 2 oak trees. It didn't move, just stood there, and William had the overwhelming impression that it was watching him. He couldn't make out details, just a silhouette, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, shoulders too broad, arms too long. And then it was gone. Not running away, not moving, just gone, like it had never been there. The forest sounds returned gradually, crickets first, then distant owl calls. William had rejoined his group shaking, and never told anyone what he'd seen. He'd convinced himself it was exhaustion, fear, darkness playing tricks, but he'd never forgotten it. And when he'd heard about the strange footprints found the next day, he'd wondered. Blair Addison's documentary was no longer just about Melissa Hartwell's disappearance and the man who'd confessed to killing her. It was now about the possibility that something else had been present that night, something that couldn't be easily explained or dismissed. The film crew wanted to do a night shoot in the woods near the grain elevator. Sheriff Ortiz initially refused. It was dangerous, potentially disrespectful to Melissa's memory, and frankly, it felt like sensationalism. But Patricia Hartwell, surprisingly, approved of the idea. "I want to know the truth," Patricia told Ortiz during a private conversation. "All of it. If something else was out there that night, if there's more to what happened to Melissa than Pike told us, I need to know. I've spent 27 years with questions. I can handle a few more if it means getting real answers." So on a humid night in early July, the documentary crew, Sheriff Ortiz, Deputy Webb, and a handful of volunteers gathered at the grain elevator as sunset faded into darkness. They had professional equipment, night vision cameras, thermal imaging, audio recording devices, sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from 50 yards away. The plan was simple. They'd spread out in small groups, covering the same areas that had been searched in 1997, and document whatever they found. It was part recreation, part investigation. Claire Addison made it clear this wasn't ghost hunting or supernatural investigation. They were simply trying to understand the environment, the sounds, the feel of the place at night. Context for the story. Ortiz was paired with Marcus Webb and a camera operator. They took the woods northwest of the grain elevator, the same area William Garrett had been searching in 1997. The night was clear, moon nearly full, providing decent ambient light once their eyes adjusted. But under the forest canopy, darkness was absolute beyond their flashlight beams. They walked slowly, cameras rolling, documenting everything. The sounds of the forest were normal: insects, the occasional rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, a distant barking dog from one of the farms. Nothing unusual. They searched for nearly 2 hours, finding nothing but trees, thorns, and decades of accumulated leaf litter. And then, around 11:30 p.m., everything changed. The forest went quiet. Not gradually. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, there was the ambient chorus of a summer night. The next, there was nothing. Just oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Webb noticed it first. "You hear that?" he whispered. "I don't hear anything," the camera operator said. "Exactly." They stood still, waiting. Ortiz felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. She'd been in the woods at night hundreds of times. She'd grown up hunting with her father, had conducted searches and investigations in every kind of terrain. This silence was different. It felt wrong, unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then they heard it. A sound from the north, deeper in the woods. Heavy, rhythmic thuds, footsteps unmistakably, but spaced too far apart, too heavy to be human. Something large was moving through the forest. "Everyone stay together," Ortiz said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. She radioed the other groups. "All units, check in. Anyone moving north of the grain elevator?" The responses came back negative. All other groups were accounted for, all stationary or moving in different directions. The footsteps continued, closer now. Webb raised his flashlight, pointing it toward the sound, but the beam just disappeared into the darkness and dense vegetation. Nothing visible. The camera operator was filming, his hands shaking slightly but keeping the shot steady. "Should we follow it?" he asked. Every instinct Ortiz had was screaming no, but they'd come out here for answers. "Stay close, stay together, and if I say run, you run." They moved toward the sound, slowly, carefully. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was a different sound, something moving through brush, heavy branches being pushed aside, and underneath it all, a smell. Wet dog, musk, something metallic. The same smell old hunters had described, the same smell mentioned in those half-dismissed stories. They reached a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across. The moonlight penetrated here, silvering the grass. And in the soft earth at the clearing center were footprints, fresh ones. The same pattern that had been found in 1997, large, elongated, with distinct claw marks. Several prints leading from the north side of the clearing to the south, then disappearing into the undergrowth. The camera operator swept his lens across them, capturing every detail. Ortiz knelt down, examining them with her flashlight. The edges were crisp, the depth significant. These had been made within the last few minutes, while they were walking in these woods. Whatever made them had been close, very close. "Rachel," Webb said quietly, his voice tight. He was looking at something on the far side of the clearing, his flashlight pointed at a tree. Ortiz stood and walked over. About 9 feet up the trunk of an oak tree were fresh scratches. 4 parallel gouges through the bark, deep enough to expose the white wood underneath. The same pattern as the marks in the grain elevator. Made by something with claws, something tall enough to reach that high without climbing. "We need to get back to the others," Ortiz said. Her training was telling her to secure the scene, to call for backup, to investigate. But her instincts were telling her to leave now, before whatever had made these marks decided to come back. They radioed the other groups, told them to return to the grain elevator immediately. The walk back felt like it took hours, though it was only 15 minutes. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound was amplified, and the silence followed them, that unnatural absence of noise that shouldn't exist in a summer forest. When they reached the grain elevator, the other groups were already there, everyone speaking in hushed, urgent tones. 2 other groups had experienced the same thing, the sudden silence, the sense of being watched, the sounds of something large moving nearby. One group had found more tracks. Another had captured thermal imaging footage of something moving through the trees, a heat signature too large to be deer, moving on 2 legs instead of 4. Claire Addison's face was pale, but her eyes were bright with the intensity of someone who'd stumbled onto something far bigger than expected. "We got it on camera. All of it. The prints, the scratches, the thermal imaging. This is real. Whatever is out here, it's real." The shoot was concluded quickly after that. No one wanted to stay in those woods anymore. They packed up equipment, returned to town, and spent the rest of the night reviewing footage in the conference room of the sheriff's office. The evidence was undeniable. Something had been in those woods with them. Something large, something that walked upright, something that left tracks unlike anything in the zoological record. The thermal signature showed a figure approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a gait that was distinctly bipedal. But what was it? A bear, possibly, though the movement pattern was wrong, and black bears weren't known for this area. A person in a costume, though that seemed absurdly elaborate and dangerous. Or something else, something that didn't have a name in scientific literature, something that existed in the spaces between what we know and what we're willing to accept. By dawn, Sheriff Ortiz had made a decision. She was reopening the Melissa Hartwell investigation, not to challenge Pike's conviction, but to investigate the possibility of unknown factors that night in 1997. She contacted the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, requesting a full wildlife survey of the area. She reached out to cryptozoology experts, despite her skepticism, because at this point she needed to consider every possibility. And she went back to interview Leonard Pike. Pike was initially resistant to another interview, but his attorney agreed when Ortiz explained she wasn't questioning his confession. She just had follow-up questions about environmental factors. They met in a conference room at Menard Correctional Center, Pike in an orange jumpsuit, chains on his wrists and ankles. Ortiz laid out photographs on the table between them, the footprints from 1997, the fresh tracks they'd found, the scratches in the grain elevator and on the trees. She asked Pike directly, had he seen anything unusual that night? Had there been anyone else around? Any animals, any sounds, anything at all that he hadn't mentioned in his confession? Pike stared at the photographs for a long time. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "You think I'm the only monster that was out there that night?" Ortiz leaned forward. "I think you were there. I think you hurt that girl. But I also think something else was there. And I think you saw it." Pike was quiet for a long moment, his chained hands clasped in front of him. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, less controlled. "I heard something. When I was with her, near the grain elevator, I heard something moving in the woods, coming closer. Heavy steps, and the woods got quiet, just dead silent. I got scared. That's why I moved so fast. Why I put her in the truck and drove out of there. I thought someone was coming, thought I was about to get caught." "What did you see?" Ortiz pressed. "I didn't see anything. It was dark, but I felt watched. Like something was out there, just beyond where I could see, waiting. I got her in the truck and I drove, and I swear to God I saw something in my rearview mirror. Just for a second, standing at the edge of the trees, tall, way too tall. But then I looked again, and it was gone. Why didn't you mention this before?" Pike laughed, a bitter sound. "Because who's going to believe me? I'm already confessing to killing a kid. If I start talking about monsters in the woods, they're going to think I'm trying for an insanity defense. so I kept it to myself. Ortiz gathered the photographs and stood. "Thank you for your honesty." As she was leaving, Pike called out, "Sheriff, that thing, whatever it was there before I showed up. When I first saw Melissa walking, when I pulled over, there was already something wrong. She kept looking behind her like she was nervous about something. I thought maybe she'd noticed my truck, but now, I don't know. Maybe she was already being followed. Maybe I wasn't the first thing that found her that night." Was Melissa running from one predator, only to encounter another? Leonard Pike's words stayed with Sheriff Ortiz long after she left Menard Correctional Center. The idea that Melissa might have been fleeing from something before Pike ever grabbed her opened a horrifying new possibility, that the girl had been caught between two predators that October night, one human and one unknown, both equally dangerous in their own ways. The documentary aired 4 months later, in November 2024, on a major streaming platform. Claire Addison had titled it The Walker, the Melissa Hartwell Mystery. It was 6 episodes, each one building on the previous, weaving together the human story of Pike's crime with the inexplicable physical evidence that suggested something else had been present. The filmmaking was respectful, thoughtful, never exploitative. Patricia Hartwell's interviews formed the emotional core, her grief and strength resonating with viewers worldwide. But it was the final episode, featuring the night shoot in the woods, that captured global attention. The footage of the fresh footprints, the thermal imaging of something massive moving through the trees, the scratches too high to be made by any known animal, it all painted a picture that defied easy explanation. Within days of its release, the documentary went viral. True crime enthusiasts, cryptozoology forums, academic researchers and casual viewers all weighed in with theories, analysis and heated debates. Corridon suddenly found itself thrust back into the spotlight, but this time the attention was different. News crews arrived not just to cover Melissa's story, but to investigate the possibility of an unknown creature in the Illinois wilderness. Wildlife experts, primatologists, even a team from a prominent university's anthropology department descended on the small town. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources conducted the most thorough wildlife survey in the region's history. They set up trail cameras throughout the woods near the grain elevator, collected hair samples, analyzed soil and vegetation, interviewed local hunters and farmers. The survey took 3 months and cost nearly $100,000. Their official report, released in February 2025, was carefully worded. It acknowledged the unusual footprints and scratch marks, but stopped short of confirming any unknown species. The conclusion suggested a combination of factors: misidentified black bear activity, feral dog populations, natural weathering patterns on metal structures, and the possibility of staged evidence related to local folklore. The report was thorough, professional, and ultimately unsatisfying to everyone involved. Because it didn't account for everything. It didn't explain the thermal imaging footage showing clear bipedal movement. It didn't explain witness testimonies spanning decades from different people with no connection to each other. It didn't explain the timing, why all this activity seemed to center around the exact location where Melissa Hartwell had disappeared. Independent researchers were less constrained by bureaucratic caution. Dr. Elizabeth Monroe, a primatologist from Berkeley who'd spent 15 years studying gorilla behavior in Central Africa, traveled to Corridon to examine the evidence firsthand. She reviewed the footprint casts from 1997, the fresh prints from the documentary shoot, and the thermal footage. Her analysis, published in a peer-reviewed journal on primate behavior, was cautiously groundbreaking. Dr. Monroe couldn't definitively identify what had made the prints, but she could rule out known animals. The gait pattern, stride length, and foot morphology didn't match bears, didn't match any canine, didn't match human beings. The claw structure suggested something with flexible, gripping digits, more similar to primate hands than animal paws. and the thermal signature showed body mass and movement patterns consistent with a large bipedal primate, something that shouldn't exist in Illinois, but nevertheless appeared to. She stopped short of declaring it a new species that would require physical specimens, DNA evidence, photographic documentation that met scientific standards. But she stated clearly that the evidence warranted serious investigation, not dismissal. Something was in those woods. What it was remained an open question. For Patricia Hartwell, all of this was deeply complicated. She'd finally gotten answers about her daughter's death, finally gotten justice against the man who'd killed her. But now, those answers felt incomplete. If something else had been stalking Melissa that night, if her daughter had been running scared even before Pike grabbed her, then the narrative she'd constructed, the story she told herself to make sense of 27 years of grief, was more complex and more horrifying than she'd imagined. Sheriff Ortiz visited Patricia regularly through those months, keeping her informed, making sure she was coping with the renewed media attention. During one visit in late February, over coffee in Patricia's kitchen, the same kitchen where Melissa had eaten breakfast on the last morning of her life, they talked about what it all meant. "Do you believe it?" Patricia asked. "That there's something out there, something we don't understand?" Ortiz chose her words carefully. "I believe there are things we can't explain yet. I believe the evidence suggests something was in those woods that doesn't fit our normal understanding. Whether it's an undiscovered animal, a known animal behaving unusually, or something else entirely, I don't know. I'm a sheriff, not a scientist. My job was to find who killed your daughter. We did that. Leonard Pike did that." "But he might not have been alone," Patricia said quietly. "No, he might not have been alone." Patricia stared out the window at the bird feeder in her backyard. She kept it filled year-round now, had started after Melissa disappeared, a small way of honoring her daughter's love of birds. A cardinal was perched there, brilliant red against the grey winter sky. "I've thought about it a lot," Patricia continued, "about what might have happened, and I've realized something. It doesn't change how I feel. Melissa was taken from me. Whether it was just Pike, or Pike and something else, or Pike interrupting something else, she's still gone, and she's still my daughter, and I still miss her every single day." "That's all that really matters," Ortiz said. "But I want the truth, whatever it is, because Melissa deserves for people to know what happened to her. All of it. The truth, as best as investigators could piece together from 27 years of evidence, Pike's confession, and new discoveries, was this. On October 23, 1997, 14-year-old Melissa Hartwell left her house to walk to her friend's home. She never arrived. Somewhere along that route, she changed course, either by choice or circumstance, and headed toward the old grain elevator outside of town. The reasons for this detour remained unclear. Perhaps she'd seen something interesting, perhaps she'd been lured by someone she trusted, or perhaps she'd been fleeing from something that frightened her. What was clear was that she'd been in distress. The cadaver dogs had tracked her scent running into the woods, not walking. Her sketchbook had been dropped or torn from her hands with enough force to rip the pages. And at some point during that evening, Leonard Pike had grabbed her, likely near the access road or inside the grain elevator itself, and in his attempts to subdue her, he'd killed her. But the evidence also suggested something else had been present. The unusual footprints, fresh on the night she disappeared. The scratches, too high to be easily explained. Pike's own admission that he'd heard something in the woods, that he'd felt watched, that he'd seen something too tall to be human standing at the tree line. And Melissa's behavior before Pike encountered her, looking behind herself, nervous, possibly already running from something. Two possibilities emerged, neither provable beyond doubt, both chilling in their implications. First possibility, Melissa had encountered something in or near the grain elevator, possibly the same unknown creature that had left tracks, scratches, and terrified witnesses for decades. She'd been running from it when Pike intercepted her. Pike had killed her, but in doing so, he'd perhaps unknowingly saved her from something even worse, or perhaps robbed the creature of prey it had been stalking. The creature had remained nearby, watching, leaving tracks, possibly following Pike to see what he would do with the body before finally retreating into the wilderness when he drove away. Second possibility: there was no creature. The tracks were from a large dog or misidentified bear. The scratches were from previous visitors or natural decay. The witnesses had misinterpreted normal wildlife behavior, amplified by fear and darkness. Pike had killed Melissa through human evil, simple and terrible, and everything else was coincidence, folklore, and the human need to find patterns in chaos. Both explanations fit the facts. Neither could be definitively proven. And that ambiguity was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire case. The woods near the grain elevator became something of a pilgrimage site. Curiosity seekers, cryptozoology enthusiasts, documentary crews, and even serious researchers ventured there regularly. Some claimed to have experiences, sounds in the darkness, feelings of being watched, fleeting glimpses of something moving between trees. Others found nothing but ordinary wilderness. Sheriff Ortiz installed additional trail cameras throughout the area, more sophisticated than the DNR's survey equipment. Over the following months, they captured thousands of images: deer, coyotes, raccoons, the occasional black bear passing through, human visitors. But 3 times, on 3 separate cameras, they captured something else. The images were unclear, shot at night, subjects at distance, partially obscured by vegetation. But they showed a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, moving through the forest on 2 legs. The body proportions didn't quite match a bear standing upright, didn't quite match a human being. Enhancement and analysis by digital forensics experts couldn't definitively identify the subject. The best they could determine was unknown primate, possibly, with significant caveats about image quality and the limitations of photographic evidence. It wasn't proof, but it wasn't nothing. In April 2025, on what would have been Melissa's 42nd birthday, Patricia Hartwell organized a memorial walk. It started at the high school, followed the route Melissa had walked that October evening, and ended at the grain elevator, where a permanent memorial had been installed. A simple bronze plaque with Melissa's name, dates, and a small bird in flight. Hundreds participated. Daniel Hartwell came with his wife and 2 daughters, the youngest named Melissa. Former classmates, now middle-aged, walked in silent tribute. Sheriff Ortiz and Deputy Webb walked near the front. Claire Addison and her documentary crew filmed respectfully from a distance, capturing the community's ongoing connection to a tragedy nearly 3 decades old. At the grain elevator, Patricia spoke to the gathered crowd. Her voice was steady, stronger than it had been in years. My daughter was taken from this world too soon, by a man who chose evil. Leonard Pike stole her future, stole her dreams, stole all the years she should have had. But he didn't steal who she was. Melissa was kind. She was artistic. She loved the small things, birds and sketches and quiet mornings. She was my daughter, and she mattered. Patricia paused, looking at the woods beyond the grain elevator, the trees swaying in the spring breeze. There are questions we may never answer. There are mysteries in this world that resist explanation. But what I know for certain is this: Melissa was loved. She is remembered. And her story, all of it, the tragedy and the mystery and the unresolved questions, serves as a reminder to hold our children close, to value every moment, and to never stop searching for truth, even when it's complicated and uncomfortable. The crowd was silent except for the wind and the distant call of a crow. Patricia placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the memorial, then stepped back. One by one, others came forward, Flowers, drawings, small tokens left in memory of a girl most of them had never met, but whose story had touched something deep in their understanding of the world. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the woods, scanning the tree line with eyes that had seen too much to dismiss the inexplicable. Rachel Ortiz joined him. "You think it's still out there?" she asked quietly. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I think the woods hold their secrets, always have, always will. We found enough truth to put a killer in prison. That's more than most cold cases ever get. The rest," he gestured toward the forest, "the rest is between those trees and whatever lives in them." "That's not a very satisfying answer." Webb smiled slightly. "The truth rarely is." They stood there a while longer, watching the memorial crowd thin, watching the shadows lengthen as afternoon turned to evening. And for just a moment Marcus Webb thought he saw movement in the deep woods, something large, something watching. But when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing but trees and shadows and the endless mystery of wild places. The Melissa Hartwell case officially remains closed. Leonard Pike is serving life in prison, his conviction solid, his confession recorded and verified. Justice, in the legal sense, has been served. But the full story, the complete truth of what happened that October night in 1997, remains partially hidden, obscured by darkness and the limitations of human understanding. The grain elevator still stands, slowly collapsing year by year, awaiting the day when the county allocates funds to demolish it completely. Until then, it remains a landmark, a monument to mystery, a place where human evil and natural enigma intersected with tragic consequences. People still report strange experiences in the woods near Corridon. Hikers talk about sudden silences, about feeling watched, about finding footprints that don't match anything in field guides. Most dismiss these stories. Some document them meticulously, and a few, like Sheriff Rachel Ortiz, keep files and cameras and an open mind about what might exist in the spaces between what we know and what we're willing to believe. Patricia Hartwell lives quietly in Corridon, surrounded by memories and peace hard-won through decades of grief. She tends her bird feeders, maintains Melissa's memorial, and speaks occasionally to researchers and filmmakers still fascinated by her daughter's story. She's made her peace with uncertainty, accepting that some questions yield only partial answers. Daniel Hartwell teaches his daughters about their aunt they'll never meet, making sure Melissa's memory lives in the next generation. He tells them she loved to draw birds, that she was kind and smart and taken too soon. He doesn't tell them about the creature in the woods, about the footprints and the thermal imaging and the decades of strange reports. That complexity can wait until they're older, until they can wrestle with ambiguity and unsettling possibilities. And in the woods near the grain elevator, life continues as it always has. Deer move through the underbrush. Birds nest in the spring and migrate in the fall. Coyotes hunt at night. The creek flows, seasons change, and the forest keeps whatever secrets it holds close to its ancient heart. But sometimes, on foggy October nights when the moon is hidden and the air carries that peculiar chill that speaks of deeper cold to come, something moves through those woods, something that walks on two legs, something too large to be human, something that leaves tracks that shouldn't exist. The trail cameras occasionally capture glimpses, blurred shapes at the edge of illumination, thermal signatures that raise more questions than answers. And people who live near those woods, who've lived there for generations, continue to tell stories. Not to frighten children or entertain tourists, but because the stories are true in ways that matter beyond mere fact. They're true in the sense that something is out there, something that defies easy categorization, something that reminds us the world is larger and stranger than our comfortable assumptions allow. The scientific community remains divided. Some researchers continue investigating, convinced that physical evidence will eventually prove the existence of an unknown North American primate. Others dismiss the entire phenomenon as misidentification and mythology. The debate continues in academic journals and documentaries, both sides marshalling evidence, neither side convincing the other. But for the people of Corydon, Illinois, for Patricia and Daniel Hartwell, for Rachel Ortiz and Marcus Webb, for everyone who searched those October nights in 1997 or walked those woods in the years since, the debate is almost irrelevant. They know what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. They know that evil exists in human form, that Leonard Pike was real and his crime was terrible. And they know that something else was there too, something that lurks in the spaces between trees, that watches from shadows, that leaves signs of its passage for those willing to see. Melissa Ann Hartwell was 14 years old when she died. She loved drawing birds and wanted to be a veterinarian. She was kind to younger children, got good grades, made her mother proud. She was a real girl with real dreams, not just a mystery to be solved or a story to be told. Her life mattered. Her death was tragedy, pure and simple, a young person destroyed by human cruelty, possibly while fleeing from something older and more primal than evil, something that hunts in the deep places where civilization's light fades into wilderness. The arrest of Leonard Pike shocked the community, but it also provided a kind of closure, imperfect though it was. The monster had been caught, named, imprisoned, justice had been served. But the deeper mystery, what else was in those woods, what else might have stalked Melissa that night, remains. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to endure, to remind us that for all our technology and understanding, there are still wild places in this world, still unknown things moving through shadows, still questions that resist our need for simple answers. Sheriff Rachel Ortiz retired in late 2025. She'd spent 30 years in law enforcement, the last 2 consumed by the Melissa Hartwell case. She'd done everything possible, followed every lead, analyzed every piece of evidence, interviewed everyone with information to share. She'd put a killer in prison and investigated a mystery that had no clear conclusion. It was time to rest. But on her last day in office, she drove out to the grain elevator one final time. She stood where Melissa's sketchbook had been found, where the strange scratches marked metal and wood, where 2 decades of witnesses had reported something impossible. She thought about the thermal imaging footage, the footprints in mud, Leonard Pike's haunted confession about something watching from the trees, and she thought about something Patricia Hartwell had said months earlier. The truth doesn't always come in the shape we expect. Sometimes we have to accept that we're living in a larger, stranger world than we knew. Rachel Ortiz stood there as sunset painted the Illinois sky in shades of orange and purple, as the first stars appeared overhead, as the forest around her began its transition from day to night. She listened to the birds settling into their evening roosts, the insects beginning their nocturnal chorus, the wind moving through leaves with sounds like whispered secrets. And she accepted that she would never know everything, that some cases stayed open not because of failure, but because reality itself was more complex than filing systems and evidence reports could capture, that justice and truth were sometimes related, but not always identical, that she'd done her job, she'd found Melissa's killer, and the rest was beyond her jurisdiction. As she walked back to her car, the forest went quiet behind her. Just for a moment, just long enough to notice. And when she glanced back at the tree line, there might have been something there, tall and watching, or there might have been only shadows and the tricks that twilight plays on tired eyes. Rachel Ortiz chose to believe both possibilities simultaneously, that something was there and that nothing was there, that the world contained mysteries and that mysteries sometimes had ordinary explanations. She drove away from the grain elevator for the last time, leaving the questions and the darkness and the endless watching woods behind. but the woods remain, and the mystery remains. And on October nights when fog rolls in from the flatlands and turns familiar places strange, people in Corridon still look over their shoulders, still hurry their steps, still tell their children to be home before dark. Because Melissa Hartwell walked into darkness 28 years ago and found monsters, one human, one unknown. The human monster was caught. The other remains free, moving through the forest, leaving tracks that shouldn't exist, reminding us that the wild world keeps its own counsel and surrenders its secrets slowly, if at all. Some questions find answers in courtrooms and confessions, but others remain in the woods, waiting between the trees. Can we ever truly know what walks in the darkness beyond our understanding?